this. It's got the timing, the duration, the wavelengths that's most beneficial. And people try to replicate that with electric lighting, but it's still a bit controversial about how, to what extent that can affect our circadian health. And that there's a lot of research being done on that right now. And then the other thing I heard in what you said is just the connection to the outdoors. So our view of nature, the daylight coming in, which gives us a sense of passing weather and time of day, all of that gives us greater connection to the natural environment when we're indoors. And that can have some benefits as well. Anybody else on the positive side? Okay, how about negative? How about the challenges that people might be having with designing for daylight? What are some of the challenges there? Anybody want to raise their hand?
Emma?
It's dependent on building orientation. So certain parts of the building may be better for daylighting than other.
Good. So there's a little bit of challenge and also opportunity there because it's much more strongly related to orientation, whereas electric lighting, you can ignore all of that. Good. What's another challenge?
Rudy?
And differences between really dark interiors and really bright exteriors. Good.
So we're going to talk a lot about the idea of contrast between bright and dark areas, and that creates a potential for glare, so that if you're not being really careful about the daylight design and you're just trying to flood your space with light, there's actually more potential for visual discomfort and glare, and we're going to be talking about that a lot today too. Excellent. Anything else?
Alfonso?
Going back to the orientation comment, daylighting can be difficult depending on surrounding infrastructure, because it's harder to come to terms with that, whether or not there's large buildings surrounding your area and space.
Excellent. So context, site circumstances are going to be a lot more important in terms of design for daylight. Excellent list. Anybody else?
Kelly?
The limit to how far you can bring the natural lighting to the interior spaces?
Good. Excellent. So we'll be talking about that as well. So if you have a narrow footprint, daylighting might be easy. If you have a really deep footprint, how you deal with the perimeter versus interior spaces, that's going to become a challenge. Anything else?
Jasmine?
Yeah, I mean, there's also the internal heat gain issue.
Exactly. And so if daylight comes with a lot of direct solar gain, then that can add some thermal stress. And that's a big part of our design project. How do we balance limiting solar gain, but bringing in the natural light? So that's a core part of our design project. A couple of more before I keep moving.
Richard?
It's a lot cheaper to build the wall than to build a hole in the wall and put glass, to allow light to go in. And then also, once you create a hole, you're basically creating a hole in the envelope with the opportunity for leakage.
So potentially the added expense for a more articulated facade, but also the ease. I think that it used to be that architects really took control of the climate responsive design, the lighting, the natural heating and cooling. And now they're too often just handing that over to the mechanical engineer, the electrical engineer, and saying, here, you heat and cool, you light my building. And I'll just add a couple of more. I think that with that regard, if you hand things over to the engineers tend to like, let's just do a cookie cutter approach. Let's have uniform lighting all over. And they don't tend to think about issues of variability and visual delight and the more nuanced experiential qualities. So that was a great discussion. I am now going to switch back to sharing my screen, if I can find that. Okay, let's see if I get this right. I'm going to share the screen. All right, everybody can see the screen. We're going to go back to muting, and now I'm going to move forward with the lecture. But what I want to do is, again, encourage people to raise their hands, and Sierra and Dylan are going to monitor the chat feature. Okay. So with that, let's move on. Let me. All right, so as we've done before, let's just quickly go over the readings that people do need to pay attention to. The first reading, the required one, is where we're going to cover the fundamentals, the definitions, units, talking about glare. That's probably the most important reading that parallels the lecture. The next one about testing daylighting design using models is relevant to the design project. It's an old funky handout, but I think it's really useful in terms of model building tips. And I don't often see something like that, so we want to continue to include that. It's got some things about the artificial sky testing, which unfortunately with this remote teaching, we're not going to be able to do. That makes me very sad, but that's the way it is. So there's going to be a part of that you're not going to be able to benefit from. Now, a couple of things on the recommended reading, the supplementary readings. There's some things that dive deeper into biological needs if you're interested in that. And there's always some sections that we try to highlight in terms of sun, wind, and light. The last one, this History of the Sky video, is really cool, and I encourage you guys to check it out. The whole video is less than 5 minutes, and it was a time-lapse study that was done by artist Ken Murphy. What he did is he put a camera on the roof of the Exploratorium in San Francisco, and he took an image of the sky every 10 seconds for a year. So he then got rid of 5, so he had 360 of the 365 days, so he can create this nice mosaic, and each cell is a time-lapse movie of a single day. And as you watch this, you'll see where the middle cells are winter, those are shorter days, so they'll start going dark earlier and later. And it's really interesting, so I encourage you all to check that out. All right, so here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to cover daylighting fundamentals in the beginning and daylighting metrics. What I'm deciding to do on daylighting metrics in the spirit of this remote teaching, I think the lecture just felt too long. So what I'm going to do is just cover that briefly, conceptually. And then what I'm going to do is do a short but more detailed segment about daylighting metrics and post that online. And we might try that technique for the rest of the semester so that we can mix up a combination of these real-time Zoom lectures and then maybe some pre-recorded or offline recorded lectures. The biggest part of today is I'm going to talk about architectural strategies for glare reduction, and that's what's most relevant to the final design project. Wednesday, we have a guest speaker. It will either be Michael Martinez, or we just recently found out he may or may not be available. But I have other people who can do this, so stay tuned on who will be speaking to us remotely on Wednesday. So what are we trying to do in daylighting design? It's a combination of quantity and quality. And what's in red are the things that we're going to be focusing on in the design project. So quantity, that's if you're actually able to measure or simulate the levels of light that you're getting in a space. And we're not going to focus on the quantitative, but when you're doing that, we'll talk a little bit about it today in terms of metrics, where the goal is you're trying to get sufficient light, but not too much, and balance that. Now, in terms of quality, what we're trying to do there is really kind of create a combination of uniform distribution to reduce glare, which we'll be talking about a lot today, and also what I'll call visual delight. And that's something that's really subjective, but it's moments of more experiential delight and trying to balance the uniformity with something that just gives you that awe feeling. Another part that is going to be really important for the design project is balancing the daylight with control of direct sun. So in our case, we're going to keep it off the artwork. In a workspace, you might want to keep it off of the visual tasks. And then another goal of daylighting design, which is beyond the scope of this class, is balancing the daylighting design with the electric lighting, because you can't achieve those energy savings unless you also have associated dimming so that you can reduce the electrical lighting when you have the natural light coming in. So today we're going to talk a little bit about quantity, primarily in terms of defining metrics, but we won't be testing for those. And we're going to be focusing on quality. This is an example that we've shown you before of the Kimball Art Museum that does a lovely job of achieving both. It's primarily a top lighting strategy that distributes light over a large surface. And we're going to see that lighting with natural light is really about not just bringing it into the volume of space, but really thinking about how do we distribute it over surfaces. That's what's going to give us the qualities of light. So let's get into a few fundamentals here about what are the different components or sources of daylight. So the two main things I want to point out in this picture is one, the dark line, solid line that says direct sunlight, right? So that is this one here. I think you can maybe see my cursor on the screen when I'm moving it. Yep, looks like it. So I'll try that when I can. So that's the piece that we're actually trying to address when we talk about shading. That's the direct beam from the sun. That's where you get a lot of heat from the sun. And we're going to want to control that to reduce cooling loads. So in particular for our project, when we're trying to create indoor light levels that are not too high for the art, you're really going to want to pay attention to this direct sunlight. You're also going to want to pay attention to the direction, because we want to keep it out not only for the light levels, but also to prevent it from hitting the art directly. Now, the other part that's going to be particularly important is this large sort of salmon-looking line here, and that's what we call the sky component. This refers to the diffuse light from the sky. It's probably the second most important element you'll be exploring in your projects, keeping out the direct beam, but bringing in that diffuse light. And this is where we want to develop an intuitive understanding of the distribution of the sky component, which is what I'm going to show you on the next slide. Now, the other two ones, which are this dotted line, the externally reflected component, and the orange line, the internally reflected component. Those two are most dependent on circumstances of your site, and it's a bit harder to generalize about. So it's good for you to know that those exist, but not something that you'll be focusing on. So let's look now at this idea of the sky component only. There's really big differences between overcast and clear sky conditions. And that's something you need to have a good understanding of in terms of, first, what are the patterns in the location that you're going to be doing your design project on? And then how do you take that into account, whether you primarily have overcast or clear sky conditions? Because this is not only going to change the level or magnitude of illuminance, but it also changes the distribution of brightness in the sky. So I want you to look for a moment at these photos here on the right, right? The photos on the right are on the left column is overcast sky, the right column is clear sky. The photos on the top of each of those are fisheye photos. So it's a fisheye camera that's looked up at the sky. And then the bottom are contours of the relatively light and dark areas. So if you look at the overcast sky, these two pictures here on the left, what you see is that the brightest part of the dome is right in the middle. Okay, it's right kind of at the zenith, directly overhead. And the dimmest part of the sky in an overcast sky is the perimeter. And if you look at the lower, this diagram here on the lower left side, that is going to show you that there's a 3-to-1 ratio between the brightness at the very top of the sky and what it is at the perimeter. So this is actually the distribution that we create in that artificial sky that you saw in your term, the tour, the big box. So this is a classic distribution. So if you are designing for an overcast climate, you need to know that the brightest part of the sky is above. And so the way skylights are going to work versus vertical windows may be very different. Now on a clear day, the images on the right, the brightest part is obviously where the sun is going to be. So in this picture, you see right here where the sun is, you look down here on the contours, and that's the brightest part of the sky. The darkest part of the sky is actually opposite. If you look dark here on the contours. So if in a clear sky, if you point to the sun and then you move your opposite arm sort of in a mirror angle centered on the zenith, your arms are going to be pointing to the brightest and the darkest parts of the sky. So this is also shown in the diagrams up here in the upper left, where you see the overcast sky, the brightest region is at the zenith at the very top. And in the clear sky here, the brightest region is wherever the sun happens to be. And then the dimmest region is going to be opposite that. Again, a mirror image centered on the zenith. So let's look now at the units that we use to describe lighting levels. And this can get a little bit confusing. So this is something you might need to look at a few times. So let's start with what I consider one of the more familiar units we use, and that's a lumen. When you go out and buy light bulbs, it often lists on there what the lumens are of that light bulb. So a lumen is a true measure of the light output and brightness. So what's the other thing that we see when we buy a light bulb? It says wattage. Well, back in the day when we only had incandescent lights, the wattage, we kind of use that as our familiar reference for brightness. Do you have a 25 watt bulb? Do you have a 100 watt bulb? Wattage is the energy actually used to create that brightness. And happily, now that we have increasingly efficient bulbs, the compact fluorescent lights and then the LED lights, you can get the same brightness with much smaller wattage. So wattage is no longer quite as familiar as a consistent reference for how to create brightness. So lumens is one of those units that will be more familiar to us. So in talking about terms and units, a really important distinction is what falls on a surface versus what we see. So I'm going to show you a couple of slides that make that distinction. So first, you've got the source of light, the light bulbs that we were just talking about. We describe the brightness in terms of lumens, that's the unit, and this is what we're talking about in terms of, we also refer to this as the luminous flux. That's the total quantity of light emitted by a light source. But then what happens is that light is going to fall on a surface, which is going to be some distance away from the light source. And we describe the amount of light that is incident on a surface as the illuminance. But that's not necessarily what we see. What we see is on the right side of this image, and that is what is reflected off of that surface, and that's the quantity of light that actually reaches our eyes. So that's luminance. Luminance is the light leaving a surface. That's the perceived brightness of that surface, and that's what we actually see. So let me elaborate that a little bit more. And this trick on the bottom in red, I use this still all the time. This is how I remember what those two terms mean. Illuminance starts with an I. That's the light that's incident on a surface, that's falling on a surface. Luminance starts with an L. So I think that's the light leaving a surface, and that's what we're going to see. So while illuminance, what falls on a surface, is the most common metric we use, it's the basis for codes and standards, it's what we're going to measure when we are measuring things in the artificial sky. Illuminance is often characterized in terms of lumens per area. So if lumens is the brightness of the light source, we know intuitively the farther away you are, just imagine you've got a flashlight, and if it's right next to a surface, it's very bright. If that surface is farther away, it's going to be less bright. So the lumens that are part of the luminous flux from that light source, what actually falls on a surface is going to be described as lumens per square foot or lumens per square meter. So the lumens per square foot, that's exactly what we use as the term foot candles. A lot of lumens per meter squared in the IP, and there's just a 1-to-10 ratio or conversion. IP and SI system. Foot candles is the lumens per square foot. Lux is lumens per square meter, and it's about 1-to-10. So all of that is the most common. It's the basis for codes and standards, but it's not actually what we see. So when we're going to talk about glare, we have to be talking about what we see. And that's the luminance, the light that's leaving a surface, the perceived brightness. And that's a less common unit. We use candelas, and again, either candelas per square foot or per square meter. So back to illuminance, the brightness of the source of light and the amount of light that actually reaches a surface, of course, is going to depend on how far away you are. I used the example of the flashlight. And the distance, it's not linear. It's actually the amount of light that falls on a surface is inversely proportional to the square of the distance. So if you're 5 feet or 15 feet away from a light source, a flashlight, an electric light, a skylight, whatever that source is, even though you're 3 times the distance, you're going to have 1/9 the amount of light falling on that surface. So as soon as you start moving away from a light source, it falls off pretty quickly because it's inversely proportional to the square of that distance. Okay, so let's look intuitively at some numbers, right? What do our eyes see? What are those numbers? Now, we know that our eyes can see across a really wide range of light levels. These pictures are familiar. We've all been in a dim parking lot. We've all been outside on a sunny day. The foot candles range from 1 to 8,000 across those different pictures. And that's, I think, pretty amazing that our eyes are so adaptable that we're able to see across that wide range. Now, I put circled here the levels of light for a typical classroom because I want you to have an intuitive feel for what a foot candle is. So most indoor environments, a classroom to an office, is maybe 30 to 50 foot candles. The Illuminating Engineering Society puts out these recommended lighting levels for different activities. So a few of these are seen below. And you can see that in the bottom ones for conferencing, for reading, this 30 to 50 is a kind of typical range of what we might have in indoor spaces when you're trying to read. You don't need as much light if you're using a computer. We're all familiar with that. So I also want to point out this number 30-foot candles, because we're going to see this number later related to daylighting metrics. Now, I put this under lighting fundamentals because it's a rule of thumb that is held up for over 30 years now. It's actually a pretty good thing to remember. And the rule of thumb here, first, it applies to unilaterally lit spaces. So when you have a window on only one side, and it also is for overcast sky conditions. So this is then when you have direct beam, solar gain, all of these go out the window. So for overcast skies, windows on only one side, the rule of thumb is that the effective daylight area is 2.5 times the head height of the window. Well, a couple of odd things about this. The first thing you might be thinking is, why doesn't this have anything to do with how big the window is? Is this really going to apply for a big floor-to-ceiling window and a clear story where the head height might be the same, but the window sill might vary? And as a rule of thumb, yeah, that's what this rule of thumb is saying. What it's saying is that the height of the window head is the critical condition. And the height of the window sill, the bottom, is not as critical in terms of how deep that penetration might be. It might make a difference on how much light comes in, of course, but in terms of the daylight penetration, it's really just the height of the window. Now, a thing to note here is, where do you measure that height from? Some people take it from the floor. Others start at the work plane, which might make more sense in my mind if you're talking about daylighting for office work and you're talking for a desk. But in either case, the most important thing I want you to remember about this rule of thumb is that it's the height of the window that makes the biggest difference. So I'd like to pause for a moment here and ask Sierra if there's any chat questions that you'd like to bring to my attention. I'm going to let Sierra monitor this so I can focus more on the slides.
There was a question about the round, colorful graphs on the side contrasting overcast and clear skies, and whether there's a name for those graphs.
Just you mean the contour lines?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just call them contour lines. I don't know if there's any other name I've heard.
Great, and it looks like there was a question about foot candles and redefining that with relation to the concept of illuminance.
Okay, so the foot candles is applied to illuminance. So illuminance is where the light that's falling on a surface itself. So whenever you hear the term foot candles, and it's referring to, it's very commonly used, how much light is in this space, it's like it takes the person and our perceived brightness out of the picture. It's really a measurement at the surface.
Great, I think that's all the questions.
Okay, excellent. So there's going to be several points throughout the lecture. We'll all pause in this way and ask Sierra if she wants to offer anything. All right, so looking at this rule of thumb, here's a couple of examples of spaces, both of which I've been in, where this ratio of 2.5 times the window head height is at play. And it speaks to the importance of these taller, clear story windows, where you can have a very deep space, but because you have a window that's very high, it bounces light fairly deeply into the space. Okay, so now I'd like to move to this idea of daylighting metrics. And this is where I mentioned earlier that what I'm going to try to do, given this remote environment, is that I'm going to just give you a kind of high-level overview of this topic, looking really at some of these metrics in a conceptual way. And then I am going to create an offline recorded presentation of an expanded version of just this segment with more technical details. So in starting, I like to use the analogy of these food labels for thinking about what we mean when we talk about metrics, targets, and thresholds, right? So I'll use the word target in this case to be the daily recommended value that nutritionists have decided on. This is our target. This is what you're aiming for, what's considered healthy. Now the metrics, this is how are we describing on this label what's actually there. And on these labels that we've become very familiar with, there's two metrics. One is an absolute measure of how much is there in terms of grams. And the other is a percent of daily value, another metric that's offered on this label, but it's in relationship to this target. Now, the last thing I want to introduce is this idea of a threshold. And that's a little bit more subjective. What's good, what's bad, right? What are you trying to do for your own diet? Are you trying to reduce fat? Are you concerned about salt? Are you trying to increase your proteins, right? So what's your personal threshold so you can decide what's too little, what's too much? So when we apply this to daylighting metrics, there's two main categories. There's a static and a dynamic daylighting metrics. The static daylight metric that most people use is called daylight factor. This is widely used. It's really straightforward. It's basically just a ratio of what's inside on a surface to what's outside. And this is again about illuminance. It's what's measured on a surface. So it's what's falling on the external, such as the roof, what's falling inside, you take the ratio of that. So it's a very widely used metric. It's only applicable for overcast skies, but that's exactly why we use this as the metric when we are doing testing in the artificial sky. And because it's only for overcast sky, it's also insensitive to orientation and time of day. We showed that in a clear sky condition, orientation and time of day really matters because the patterns of light distribution are going to depend on where the sun is. So it's valuable in terms of it's easy to use. It's got these limitations. So along comes the idea of dynamic daylighting metrics. This is based on more realistic conditions. It could be clear or cloudy sky conditions. You use outdoor weather files, you do computer simulation, you look at what's happening in the space over a period of time, usually a whole year. It's very complicated. So what is a daylighting metric? Well, there's a lot of metrics out there. As soon as we started having the power of computer simulation for looking at interior light levels, everybody had a different idea about how we might define these. And there's still a lot of controversy about which ones best correspond to true occupant preferences, and also which ones are nuanced enough to differentiate between good and bad architectural designs. But these highlighted in red are the two daylighting metrics which are most commonly being used. And so I'm just going to define these conceptually here. And then in the offline recorded lecture segment that I will post later, I will explain in more technical detail how you actually determine these. But conceptually, I want you to think of these as kind of the floor and the ceiling. How much is enough? How much is too much? And you need to use these together. They're both used as a pair in certification systems such as LEED. Spatial daylight autonomy, you're trying to make that a big number. Is there sufficient daylight so we don't have to use electric lighting? How much of the space can be adequately lit with daylight? So this is a good thing. You want to get that up. But what if you have direct solar gain? What if you have too much, right? What if you have glare? What if you have overheating? So there's a second metric called annual sunlight exposure. Again, I'll show you in that later segment how to actually calculate it. But conceptually, what we're doing here is just saying, we want daylight, we don't want too much. So that's going to be the ceiling. Is there too much for glare and overheating? And that's where you calculate that metric and you want to reduce that. So you actually use those together. All right, are there any new questions on this material, CR, that you want to share with us?
I don't see any new questions so far.
Okay, great. So now I want to move into avoiding visual discomfort. This is the goal we're going to spend the most time on today. It relates to both the quantity, is it adequate for the task? I know we just talked about quantity, but it's also on this list because if you don't have enough light, that can also create discomfort and fatigue on the eyes. But we're really going to focus on quality. And there's 3 different things that I want to talk about. Are the sun and shadow patterns distracting? Are there veiling reflections? And I'll show you in a moment what that means. And then the biggest one we're going to talk about in this class, and what's most relevant for your design project and for museums, is the idea of glare. So shadows and patterns. Sometimes you can really go overboard with the amount of direct solar beam radiation that you bring into a space in a way that it might cause really stark sun and shadow patterns. So if you're in a transition space or you're intentionally trying to create this visual drama, that might be okay. But imagine being in a space like the one pictured on the right, and you're trying to read or take notes. Part of your book might be in a bright patch next to a dark shadow, and it's going to be really difficult. So this would quickly become a case of visual discomfort. The second source of visual discomfort is what is called veiling reflections. And this refers to the kind of specular reflections that you might get from shiny surfaces, as opposed to the scattered reflections you might get from matte surfaces. And these specular reflections you get, if those appear on the object you're viewing, it might make it really difficult to see details because it reduces the contrast. So if the surface is so shiny that it glints, it makes it hard to actually see things. But veiling reflections don't just refer to tasks on a desk. This is an example of an exterior sign that's hard to read because of the veiling reflections that are mirroring the street behind the sign. And another common example of the same thing is on our computer screens, which are then reflecting what's in front of the screen. So you can see on the left side of the screen that has a lighter background, you don't see the reflections as much as on a dark background on the right side. And so when you're using computers in our daylit studio floors, that's a great place in our own environment where you may see that these veiling reflections makes it hard for you to see things. And the final source of visual discomfort is glare, which is what I want to talk about in more detail today. So this image shows the classic example. Someone's sitting in front of a bright window and you mostly see their silhouette and you can't see any details in their facial features. So what is glare? Glare is about luminance. What's luminance? L, leaving a surface. This is the amount of light that's leaving a surface. It's the perceived brightness. It's what we actually see. And there's several sources of glare. We're going to talk shortly about architectural strategies to reduce glare. But most important point here is that it comes from contrast of really bright next to dark surfaces. So when the eye sees a bright surface, the pupil constricts, and then that's going to limit the amount of light that's transmitted inside our eye and going to make it more difficult to then see the relatively dimmer surfaces. And there's recommended ratios for what those contrast levels should be to minimize the visual discomfort from glare. And the most important idea here is that when your eyes move around and scans around tasks, it doesn't want to go through a lot of changes. Our brows are actually pretty good at blocking some of the contrast in the higher parts of the room, so we're rarely concerned about that. We're mostly concerned with the lower parts of the room and the kind of tasks we're trying to do. So when you're working on a task, you mostly want to limit the contrast, the field between the task you're working on, imagine you're reading a piece of paper, and the adjacent surfaces. So here you can see in the table that the recommendation is no more than a 3-to-1 ratio, so that the pupil of the eye is not constantly changing. Now, as your head, your eyes start to scan around the room, you can withstand a higher contrast, maybe up to 10-to-1. Right? Now, here's an important point. If you have any direct solar gain in a space, you're likely to very quickly exceed a 40-to-1 ratio for the room overall. So that's one of the reasons why having direct gain into a space can be very problematic for visual comfort. Now, this is a big category, and this is what we're going to spend a lot of time on starting now. So one of the things I want to emphasize here is that you can use this as a checklist of things you can do to reduce glare. And I'm going to go through them, and I encourage you to come back to these frequently for your design project. So one of the first things you can do is light colored window frames. This makes a huge difference in reducing glare. What you're trying to do is create a softer gradient between the window, which is going to be the brightest surface, and the surrounding walls. So in the left and the lower right image, the point being shown in these pictures are just the window mullions, the frames that separate the panes of glass, that these are white, these are light colored, and that's really going to help. If these were dark colors, they create more of a contrast. But I mostly want to talk about the upper right image, these Shoji screens. So what's happened by opening these, what you're doing is you're creating a slightly translucent surface surrounding the windows. So the eye moves from the when the eye moves from the brightest surface, the window, to the surrounding dark walls, it goes across a gradient from the bright to continually darker surfaces. So you've created a transition rather than going directly from bright to dark. And you can see that the clear story in that image is also made out of Shoji paper as well. So a caveat that's important. Let's imagine that your translucent surface is frosted glass. Frosted glass is interesting because if the sun hits it directly, it can be incredibly bright. And so you think that you're softening the light levels, but you can actually make it even brighter. And so what you want to do is make sure that if you do something like that, that the direct beam solar radiation is not hitting that surface directly, and or it's not in our direct field of view. So this example, for instance, you may not be able to see it, but it has an overhang outside, and that helps to avoid the direct beam. So that's important to note. Now, another way to make window frames light is to actually just lose the frame altogether. So this shows a really nice detail where the glass is as flush with the wall as possible. The light passes into the space interrupted with no shadow next to the window. And it's not an easy detail to do, but for our design project, you should really think about putting windows flush against the adjacent wall because it's a very effective strategy. So what you're doing is not only trying to reduce the contrast between the window and reducing the dark wall in its own plane, but most important is you're washing the adjacent wall with light. And wall washing is really effective. It's easy. It's something that I hope you all consider in the design project. all you really need, you can get a big effect from just a thin window that's adjacent to a preferably light colored wall. And then as your eye scans closer to the bright window, there's a gradual washing of light. So this is a really nice way to wash walls with light, and you can have a big effect with small slivers, which is particularly helpful in a gallery where you need a lot of the wall for framing artwork. Here's an example of that in Saarinen Christ Church in Minneapolis. These 3 images show a general picture from left to right of the exterior and exterior detail, and then the chapel interior, where you could see this visual effect of the side window that's washing the wall with light. Same spaces here. You can see the main space in the church, where inside the church itself, there's a similar move with a curved wall and a window on the side. There's a screen that blocks the view of the wall being hit directly, but you can still see this gradient. So in the middle image, it shows a detail of the screen. You can see it glows a bit, which also helps to create this transition, which is a really nice effect. Now, best is when you have windows on 2 sides, and that way the light from each direction is hitting an alternative wall. And so the 2 windows help each other out by backfilling what would otherwise be a dark wall. In general, while the brightest spot in a room is going to be the window, the darkest is going to be the wall right next to the window. So if you can take that, what would otherwise be a dark wall, and have a window and adjacent wall, that tends to filter things a bit more. Now, it works better if you combine the 2 things I just talked about. You have 2 windows on adjacent walls, but you also make them flush against the wall. So in both of these situations, you see that the windows are not only high, so we're talking about the importance of that head height, but they're flush against the ceiling, which washes the ceiling, but they're also flush against a sidewall, which will wash the wall next to it. So moving on from the wall washing strategy, this is another really effective technique that I hope most of you will consider for your design project. Buildings used to always have thick walls and therefore really thick window frames. It's even better if you take those window frames and you splay them a bit, meaning you angle them so the opening on the interior is larger than the exterior. I'm going to say that again because that's important. The opening on the interior is larger than the exterior. I sometimes see some design projects where people put the splay in the opposite direction, so be careful to avoid that mistake. So what happens when the opening on the interior is larger? Your eye then sees those surfaces directly adjacent to the window, which is now lit up. And this is a great effect that creates a more mediating transitional area between the bright window and the darker adjacent walls. This technique was also used in one of our favorite examples, the Mount Angel Library. Here you're looking at a window at the end of the book stack. The window is surrounded by these splayed walls, so you're avoiding the very sharp light-dark contrast of conventionally framed windows. Now, if the wall's thick, this is easy to do, but if the wall's thin, the lower right picture from Sun, Wind, and Light, in the right sketch, you can see how even if the wall is thin, you can project the window out from the wall to then create this same effect. New strategy, clear story windows. This is also very effective, especially for galleries where you might need the lower walls for art. The strategy here is to get the window head height higher. We talked about that for getting light deeper into space, and then reflect light in a comfortable and diffuse way into the areas below the wall. Now, there's a downside to this. There's no view, right? You're just seeing the sky. But remember, every window doesn't have to play all functions. So you can have some windows that are meant for view. You can have some windows that are meant for wall washing. You can have some windows that, such as the clear stories, that are meant for bouncing light further into the space. This is another example of a light shelf, of the clear story windows from the local Cliff Bar headquarters, which is a building that uses a lot of interesting strategies. What I want to point out is the graphs on the right, which are showing the light distribution in a section. Now, for conventional windows, shown on top, clearly there's going to be much higher levels of light right next to the window. And in some circumstances, that might be exactly what you're trying to achieve. But because it also creates a large contrast between the light levels next to compared to further away from the window, that contrast is potential glare. So the clear story windows, what they do is they reduce light levels right next to the exterior wall, which might be particularly good if you're then using art on those walls, but they bounce light deeper into the space and then create a more uniform gradient. So light shelves are a great strategy to consider for your design projects, and I encourage you to think about that. They're a classic way to bounce light further back into a space. It reduces glare by blocking the view of the bright sky, and you can then do a combination of very strategic view windows in certain parts of the lower wall below, and then use the clear story for brightening the ceiling. So the last, I think this is the last one of the strategies for the reducing glare, and this is about using light shelves as another way to bounce light further back in the space. So they're combined with a clear story window, and what it's doing is it's helping taking that upper light and bounce it further back into the space. Now, one of the things I want to point out in this diagram is the lower right image. First of all, remember this is showing profile angles, which is a projected altitude angle onto a section. But this is a classic kind of image where the arrows make it look like the surface is a mirror, and you have this bounce that's directly equivalent to the angle of incidence. And this is a classic way of representing light bouncing, but you want to be careful because the surface is rarely actually like a mirror. It's going to bounce more like a matte surface and be diffused in multiple ways. So just keep that in mind. All right, so the previous picture showed direct beam radiation bouncing further back in a room, and that is what's more likely going to happen when you have clear sky conditions and direct beam radiation. Now, in an overcast sky, the light shelves are going to work a little bit differently, and that's shown in these lower graphs. In this case, it's less about more light, and it's much more about even distribution of light and reducing glare. So at this moment, I'm going to pause again. Sierra, are there any questions that you want to share?
No new questions.
Okay. Is indirect lighting. And in this category, I'm going to talk about 4 ways of doing this. So one is the idea of borrowed light. This is where the space of interest is actually borrowing light from an adjacent space that has the exterior glazing. So you can see this left example shows how the corridor can borrow light through the glazed doors. The borrowed light is lower, but that's okay for a corridor. And the right example shows a better example using clear story windows in an interior wall. The second example of indirect lighting is what I'll call reflected light, which takes advantage of light-colored exterior surfaces. So this is the exterior and section drawings for architect Rick Joy's studio. It's very simple. It's essentially a box with no windows on the south side, and it wraps around a central courtyard. And you can see the reflected light better in this picture. It's showing the courtyard and the interior studio. It's separated from an all-glass wall. The wall is facing north, and the interior spaces are primarily lit by reflection from the exterior surface in the courtyard. So the light is hitting this backyard of the courtyard, which is facing south. You can see it's very bright and it's in the sun, and then that's bouncing back into the space. To represent a whole continuum that we think about in electric lighting design. At one end, you design electric lighting fixtures to provide just exactly what you need. Think about task lighting on your desk. You design electric lighting fixture, and fixtures might be just very sculptural. And it's the same thing for daylighting fixtures, where sometimes it's for effect, not necessarily function. And that's entirely appropriate for some places and some buildings. So here's an example of using examples of natural light to create the appearance of a fixture for distributing the light. These windows are not simply punched openings, but they can be elements that act like a diffusing screen. And then the last example of indirect lighting would be skylights. And we've actually seen a lot of these throughout the slideshow, but I wanted to show a couple that highlight the features of what makes an effective skylight. And particularly for the design project, a lot of people are going to be doing top lighting. So some things to pay attention to. To be effective, skylights are best if they have a well, something that's deep enough to keep the direct beam radiation from coming into large areas, and especially keeping it from striking the artwork directly. So what you're trying to do is have it strike the upper surface of the skylight well first, and then that becomes a mediating surface, and the light coming into the space is more diffuse. All right, any other questions, Sierra, that you want to share?
No, I haven't seen any new questions.
All right. Let's, so we got about 10 minutes left. I think that's perfect timing to go over some things. I want to just finish the lecture with some general concepts about architectural space making. As an architect, you have control over form and openings and exterior and interior surfaces. So you really want to think about how these are going to affect the quality of the light and how those change for time of day, for both clear and cloudy sky conditions. So I love this picture because I think it really conveys, this pair of pictures, the dynamic qualities of daylight, which can dramatically change the experience of a space during the course of the day. This is a west-facing double-height space. The image on your left was taken under diffuse sky conditions. The image on the right under conditions of direct solar gain. So the exact same space, and you can see that the color and vibrancy of the space completely changes. So the idea of space making is about using daylight for achieving qualities, not just quantities. It's about creating rich and often inspiring spaces by using daylight, and thinking about the idea that you're not trying to create a static environment. When you're using daylight, it's inherently dynamic. Things are always changing. So you want to think about intentionally designing for those changes. One example is about using daylight to provide a highlight, an emphasis. It fits into a notion I sometimes like to call dare to be dark. So if everything is lit uniformly brightly, you can't highlight anything. But if you bring in more light in some areas that want attention, you can actually use the daylight to highlight that. This is a really relevant strategy for your design project. You can use light as a way to lead people through a space and lead people upwards and down hallways. It's like moths following the light. So you can really think about using light as a way of sequencing through your space, as a source of wayfinding. Daylighting can also establish a rhythm through creating repetitions of light and shadow, and it's best if that's done in an intentional way. Texture can also be revealed by daylighting, such as this lap siding on the left or the concrete on the right. Now, I recognize that in your design project, where we're often using very simple materials to build the models, this isn't often paid a lot of attention to. But in the real world, it can be quite lovely. So we do ask you to consider this if at all possible. And then this is just another example of the idea of how when you have a moment when light grazes a surface, it highlights the idiosyncratic texture, such as this concrete work, in a very intentional way. And it's not going to always look like this. That wall is going to look really different during the dawn and dusk periods of the day, during the middle of the day when the light may be coming in and grazing the surface. And so you want to think about how you might be using texture in your design project, and to be doing that in an intentional way, and how you might model that, which is a challenge, but we encourage you to give it a try. All right, Sierra, any other questions you might see?
Yes, there's a question about whether highlighting would create glare.
Oh, that's a great example, whether highlighting will create glare. You know, it's the devil's in the details. It really depends on how you do it. So when you're highlighting and you're thinking about a moment, you want to think about where the occupant is and what they're actually looking at. And if you're creating a highlighted moment on something where you're hoping that person sees a lot of detail, signage or detail on the intricacies of artwork, you probably wouldn't do that. But if you want to create highlight in a place where the detail may not matter, and you still have a gradient between that area and the dark spaces, then it could be delightful. Anything else?
I think that's it.
Okay, so what we want to do, and I'm going to ask for Sierra's help here. She's going to manage the poll using Zoom. And I've never used a Zoom poll before, so we're going to give this a try. The content of this poll should somehow show up in the Zoom poll that Sierra is going to instigate. It just popped up there. You should be able to see it now. And this is a great example of a test question. So, excellent. I see that people are already responding. All right, we're gonna wrap it up soon. We're not using this for attendance. It's just helping me learn how to do Zoom polls. So we're gonna end in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And we're now gonna end the poll. Excellent, well done, Sierra. So the correct answer was B, dark finishes, and it looked like most of you got that. All right, so in closing, I just wanted to offer you some resources that I really encourage you to look at. One of them in particular is this Daylight Design Resources book that goes through a lot of different patterns that may help you think about what should I do? What kinds of strategies might I use? And for each of these patterns, it will have this field of thumbnail sketches. It'll give you a narrative description, but also this lovely film strip that shows you these different kinds of ways in plan or section to design for that. And this is what a typical pattern page might look at in terms of the common elements. So it's a fabulous resource and something you can access remotely. So I strongly encourage all of you to do that. The same lab that put that out actually has a resource specifically on daylighting museums. How lucky are we? So this is a fabulous resource for you to look at as well. And here is a list, and this will be posted on the website in terms of museums to look at. So in terms of posting, I'm going to do two things. We're going to post a recording of this lecture, which will be a very large file, but it'll be available so that you can get the audio recording. And we are also going to post the usual PDF. So it's a smaller file for you to be able to look at and download in the usual way. So with that, I am going to stay on for a while if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, I just wish you all to practice self-care of yourself, your friends, your family. Take care of yourself, and please do not hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions about the class or just stress you're going through in general. And with that, I'll stay online, and Sierra, if you could please monitor and help unmute people if they want to chat with me. And then otherwise you can log off. And when I see all the participants are gone, then I'll log off too. Otherwise I'll stick around.
Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
There was a question that just came up about what tips we have for students working on the design project when we can't meet. And I just wanted to say to those few students who are still left here for this little post-lecture session that we're going to go over that in the discussion section, but we're going to figure out a way for it to happen remotely.
Yeah, we are brainstorming that actually as soon as this meeting is over. The GSIs and I are getting together because these are new circumstances. We understand the challenge. We don't yet have a solution, but we are actively working on it, and we'll communicate to everybody as soon as we figure this out ourselves.
And there was also a question about grading, and since the project is changing slightly, we're also changing the grading criteria since we're not going to be able to use the Overcast Sky Simulator. So that will be details forthcoming.
Thank you, Eric. Anything else? All right, I'm going to end the meeting.
Oh, wait, I had a...
Yes. Yes.
Sorry, can
Please.
you clarify, I guess, it was the penetration, the daylighting penetration with the 2.5 times the H, what that head space is?
So the head height is you go to the top of the window, and I don't care where the bottom of the window is, you measure to the top of the window. Now, where do you measure from? That can either be the floor, which I think is probably most appropriate for the gallery space, but some people in workplaces will measure from the desk height. So it has everything to do with the top of the window, nothing to do with the bottom of the window, and the reference you're measuring from is either the floor or a desk height.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. Anything else? All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting, and we will continue to communicate with everybody via the announcements and the alternative instruction. And GSIs will log on in 15 minutes or at 11:15 for our meeting. Bye, y'all.